Francis Bacon was an Irish-born figurative painter who lived and worked in the 20th century. His paintings are known for their raw and unsettling imagery. Focused on the human form, his subjects included crucifixions, portraits of popes, self-portraits, and portraits of his friends and family. His works are disturbing. Created as a reaction to the brutal horrors and suffering of the Second World War, Bacon's work was obsessively interested in the grotesqueness of the human form. His subjects are warped and disfigured, but not completely out of all recognition, as they are still recognisably human. When we look at some of his paintings, the similarities with Silent Hill are obvious, especially if we compare it to the concept art for James and Eddie. Bacon was just one of the many influences for Team Silent in the development of Silent Hill. When it comes to inspirations, the team have over the years given various interviews and cited many different sources. Lead character designer Takayoshi Sato, in an interview with IGN, had this to say: "We looked at movies like Adrian Lyne's Jacob's Ladder, and movies from David Lynch. Of course, Hitchcock, David Fincher, and David Cronenberg too. Painters like Francis Bacon, Andrew Wyeth, and Rembrandt were very influential." In today's video, I want to take a look specifically at the influence that David Lynch had on Silent Hill, and through using Silent Hill 2 as a case study, examine what exactly it means when people say Silent Hill is Lynchian. Development of Silent Hill began in 1996, and it was initially meant to be Konami's version of Resident Evil, with a Hollywood style of horror action adventure. The group of people who Konami entrusted the development with were labelled Team Silent, and consisted of staff members who had mostly failed on their previous projects. Silent Hill was seen as their last chance in the company. Initial development was slow, with an unruly Team Silent repeatedly missing their deadlines, and Konami was all but ready to give up on the project before Team Silent decided to abandon the plans for a Resident Evil clone and took things in a different direction. That direction led to this. Where Resident Evil storylines were schlocky and over the top, Silent Hill storylines were understated and conflicting. Where Resident Evil had jump scares, Silent Hill had this. Where Resident Evil's atmosphere was gothic and reminiscent of a B-movie, Silent Hill's was dreamlike and surreal and psychological. Silent Hill would go on to be a massive success for Konami, selling over 8 million units as a series to this day, becoming a gaming and cultural staple, and spawning a Hollywood adaptation, and multiple spin-offs, and even remakes yet to be released. Let's start with an introduction to the term Lynchian. Lynchian is a term that gets used casually whenever anything is a bit surreal. Describing something as Lynchian is a bit like saying something's postmodern. The term is ill-defined, difficult to understand, and hard to explain, but you know it when you see it. Let's start with the definition from one of my favourite writers, David Foster Wallace. Wallace says that Lynchian is a particular kind of irony, where the very macabre and the very mundane combine in such a way as to reveal the former's perpetual containment within the latter. So in Wallace's opinion, Lynchian is the coexistence of banality and the grim. It's a way of looking at everyday occurrences and situations, and seeing the absurdity and darkness within them, because it's always present. It's the creepy, atmospheric undercurrent of something being wrong in a situation you would expect to feel normal. It's the sudden introduction of clinical violence into otherwise normal or dreamlike scenarios. I think to be truly Lynchian is quite specifically the coexistence of evil and banality within the everyday world. Lots of people seem to think that it's just the seedy underbelly of middle America that Lynch is referencing in his films, that under the well-mowed lawns and pristine cars there lies a darker truth, that dark and light forces are waging a war beneath our noses that we can't see, when in actual fact those forces are present not underneath the surface, but in all of us, all of the time. Ultimately, Lynch wants us to look into ourselves, to reflect, and to find the macabre there. The villains in Lynch's films are a reflection of our darkest selves. In Blue Velvet, Frank Booth literally turns to the camera and says, "You're like me."
What are you looking at? Nothing. Don't you look at me, fuck!
and in that moment we are all, as viewers, complicit. As Carl McLaughlin's character is watching the brutal rape scene through the shutters in the cupboard, we too are voyeurs, intruding into the lives of these people, violating them. This scene is almost directly copied in Silent Hill 2, with James watching Pyramid Head through the shutters of a cupboard. One of the other hallmarks of the Lynchian is the use of dreamlike imagery. Shots will have a blur effect or be overly contrasted or oversaturated, like this shot from Mulholland Drive. Or the scene will have bizarre elements which are out of place, but that you might find in a dream. Lynch wants to blur the line between dream and reality, between the self in real everyday life and the self in your dreams. As we will see, this is a strong theme in Silent Hill 2, with essentially the whole game taking place in the imagination of the main character. With regards to dreams, David Lynch had this to say: "Waking dreams are the ones that are important, the ones that come when I'm quietly sitting in a chair, letting my mind wander. When you sleep, you don't control your dream. I like to dive into a dream world that I've made, a world I chose and that I have complete control over." And lastly, Lynch uses themes of duality and dual identity. On that, he had this to say: "When you have a note, and another note buzzes against it, there's something in between those two notes, and that's the magical area. It's a balance. And I think since we live in a world of dualities, hot and cold, high and low, the whole thing, that any balancing point is very special." Lynch makes use of this theme through displaying different elements of one personality, through the use of doppelgangers, and through transformations both metaphorical and literal. As we will discuss later in this video, Silent Hill 2 leans heavily on this, with several characters who appear to have multiple personalities, and through the use of doppelgangers. So now that we've established some of the themes that unite the works of David Lynch, and set a rough definition for what it means to say something is Lynchian, let's take a look at Silent Hill 2, and pick out what features were inspired by the works of David Lynch. In Silent Hill 2, you play as James Sunderland. At the beginning of the story, James receives a letter from his wife Mary, asking him to meet her in the town of Silent Hill, a town of some significance from their relationship. The strange thing about Mary's letter is that she's been dead for 3 years.
The name on the envelope said Mary. My wife's name. It's ridiculous. Couldn't possibly be true. That's what I keep telling myself. A dead person can't write a letter. Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago.
As James Sunderland, you must explore the town of Silent Hill, looking for signs of your dead wife, and unravel the mystery of the letter that you've been sent. Along the way, you'll meet strange and interesting characters, fight off a horde of disfigured creatures, and solve puzzles, all whilst descending deeper and deeper into the hellscape that is the town of Silent Hill. Now let's discuss the protagonist in more detail. To look at him, you would think he's just an ordinary man, especially when we compare him to other video game protagonists of this era. And to some extent, that's true. He doesn't have a strong personality, he wears ordinary clothes, and he doesn't have any particular special abilities that make him stand out. His movement is clunky, he feels heavy to control both in and out of combat, but almost straight away, we see there's something not quite right with James. He displays some strange behaviours that make us question his mental state, and his reactions to events in the game aren't entirely natural.
I killed a human being. A human being.
Especially when you consider how bizarre some of the things that happen to him are. So early on it's established that James Sunderland is an unreliable character. The game deliberately portrays him in this way and makes you question the reality of his experience, and by extension the world that you're exploring in Silent Hill. Video games, like other forms of storytelling and art, are told from a certain perspective. What's unique about video games, however, is that for all intents and purposes you embody the character you control. In Silent Hill 2 you are James Sunderland. For every minute of gameplay, you either directly control James, or you watch eerie FMV footage of him. As James's mental state and perspectives are so in doubt, so too you must doubt what you see and experience in Silent Hill 2. By their very natures, video games require a suspension of disbelief, as the world is quite literally imaginary, made up of pixels and polygons. But more than most other games, Silent Hill 2 makes you question if James is truly experiencing this, or if this is all some dream or nightmare he's cooked up in his mind. And here is your spoiler warning. As those of you who have finished Silent Hill 2 will know, this is essentially all cooked up in James's mind. It's all a manifestation of his guilt over killing his wife. Everything he experiences is a result of repression of that memory. This blurring of the lines between dream and reality is a theme which Lynch repeatedly returns to in his movies. I read a good quote from someone about that before. The border between dream and reality in David Lynch's films is a badly guarded checkpoint where no one seems to be stamping passports. But also, just as important to Lynch is memory and representation of memories. Lynch acknowledges that memory is imperfect, and that especially following trauma, the mind will have certain defense mechanisms to deal with this. Perhaps Lynch's most iconic explorations of this concept came in Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive, two sequential films he released in the late 90s and early 2000s. Lost Highway in particular shares a lot of features with Silent Hill 2, and it's not difficult to see how it had a direct influence on Team Silent. David Lynch is quoted of saying of Lost Highway, "What does the mind do after a horrific event? Something called psychogenic fugue, also known as dissociative fugue or simply a fugue state. This is a reversible amnesia, usually in conjunction with an unexpected wandering or travel." Let's take a quick rundown of some of the similarities between Lost Highway and Silent Hill 2. Both characters murder their wives, who are both sexually inactive for one reason or another. Both repress the knowledge of their murders. Both create another world to escape from their guilt and sin. Both worlds that are created contain two versions of their wives, one sexualized and one idealized. Both characters create an evil representation of their guilt. For James it's Pyramid Head, and for Fred it's the Mystery Man. This could also be considered a representation of their consciences. And perhaps most glaringly obvious, both characters only come to the realization of what they did after they are shown videotapes of them murdering their wives. Obviously an influence is just an influence, and there are many differences between the two, not least in the endings. Silent Hill 2 has multiple endings, but most players will experience the ending where James ultimately goes through a jail, confesses, and is able to move on with his life. Whereas Fred in Lost Highway is confined to death row and is ultimately killed at the end of Lost Highway. Fred's vision doesn't impact his life in any meaningful way, whereas James's vision changes his life for the better. And now let's take a look at Mulholland Drive. What we see with Mulholland Drive is almost an inversion of the stories of Lost Highway and Silent Hill. In the beginning of the film, Diane is living her ideal dream of Hollywood, prior to her awakening and eventual suicide. In the last 20 minutes of the film, we see how Diane is really living in Hollywood, as a failed actress and a prostitute, before she eventually kills herself. In Silent Hill, James is living his nightmare as a consequence of what he's done, of which he has no memory. As he gradually remembers what he did, the visions and hallucinations start to recede, until eventually he is faced with nothing more than the fact of Mary's death on his hands. This is all related to the concept of the fugue state, the idea that we might prefer to forget the past, or that memory is not necessarily a reliable way of accessing the past. Both James and Diane are what was called the unreliable narrator. We can't trust what they're seeing. On the surface, Mulholland Drive's story is a veneer, under which Diane's struggle to accept her past actions is what we are seeing. There are strong parallels between James and Diane, and despite the fact that Mulholland Drive released the same year as Silent Hill 2, so whilst we are unable to call Mulholland Drive a direct influence on Silent Hill 2, what we can say is that Team Silent were working in the same sphere as David Lynch in terms of themes and models of storytelling. Now I'm going to move on to talk about the characters of Silent Hill 2 and draw some parallels between them and characters and archetypes in Lynch films. In his journey through Silent Hill, James comes across several people who all seem to be experiencing different versions of the town, all of whom seem to be battling something internal related to their past. All of them have archetypes and display different characteristics which are similar to those used in Lynch films. There's a femme fatale, a dangerous and unpredictable person, and a histrionic suicidal woman. Common to them all as well is that their performances are heightened, almost like something out of a soap opera. Their dialogue is somewhat stilted, with pauses that are awkward in length. Their facial expressions are strange and linger for slightly too long. Their emotions are labile, switching between happiness and despair rapidly. All of these features lend conversations with these characters an uncanny and uncomfortable feeling, reminiscent of the conversations in the films of David Lynch. Let's discuss each character in turn. I'll start with the first character you meet, Angela. It's heavily implied throughout the game that Angela is a victim of sexual abuse at the hands of her father and possibly her brother as well. On first meeting her on the outskirts of town, she tells James she's looking for her mama and warns James to stay away from Silent Hill. Her use of childlike language is contrasted with her temperament. Angela is quick to anger and seems especially suspicious of James. The next time we meet her is in the apartments, where we find her lying on the floor in front of a large mirror, looking at her reflection in the blade of a knife, contemplating suicide. The use of reflections in this scene to highlight the duality of both James and Mary is reminiscent of many of the works of David Lynch, including Blue Velvet and Mulholland Drive. In our last encounter with Angela near the end of the game, Angela is last seen standing in a burning staircase in the Lakeview Hotel. Initially, she confuses James for her mother and begins embracing him, but snaps out of her delusion and apologizes. She thanks James for saving her life, but says that she wishes he never did and instead left her to die. She tells James not to pity her and asks him if he would love her, care for her, and take away her pain. James doesn't say anything. Angela asks James to return her knife, but he says no. She asks James if he's saving it for himself, and he also answers no. Angela turns around and ascends the staircase, in a scene very reminiscent of one from Jacob's Ladder. Before she leaves, James says the room they're in is hot as hell. Angela replies, "You see it too? For me, it's always like this," and she disappears past the flames. Eddie is perhaps the most troubling character we come across in Silent Hill 2. When we first meet him, he's crouched over a toilet bowl, vomiting, and denying his involvement in a nearby murder. Eddie's physical characteristics are exaggerated. He has eyes that seem a bit too big for his head, and his pupils go in different directions, giving him a disturbed look. He, like other characters, also displays emotional lability and wild swings for motion. Eddie doesn't have any direct parallels with Lynch characters that I could think of, but his representation and mannerisms all fall within the category of what we would call uncanny. And then we come to Maria, who is the reincarnation of Mary, essentially a doppelganger. Maria falls firmly in the femme fatale archetype. She is sexually suggestive, bearing her tummy and making advances at James. She comes across as untrustworthy, tries to lead James on, and seems to know more than she should. She flits rapidly between tenderness and cruelty with James, and makes some emotionally manipulative and abusive comments to him. Maria does somewhat subvert the typical femme fatale concept, however, as she displays unexpected vulnerability. James is forced to witness her repeated death and reincarnation as part of his atonement. Maria is, as also mentioned earlier, the reincarnation of Mary, with similar physical characteristics but different social ones. This subversion of the femme fatale can be directly linked to David Lynch. The femme fatale character, which was so prevalent in the noir films of the 40s and 50s, fell out of fashion in the 80s and early 90s, as women gained more social power and were deemed less threatening to men. Makers of cinema also probably deemed that the typical portrayal of the dangerous woman was slightly misogynistic and related to the unconscious fear of the powerful woman. David Lynch in the late 90s and early 2000s brought back the femme fatale with his Hollywood trilogy, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire. But even before this in 1987 with Blue Velvet. In Blue Velvet, the character portrayed by Isabella Rossellini, Dorothy Valens, is the film's version of the femme fatale, only with a Lynchian twist. Dorothy performs some of the functions of a typical femme fatale. She is the sexually alluring female who leads the protagonist into involvement with the surprisingly dangerous criminal underworld. So far so normal. But like Maria, she displays a level of vulnerability that is out of keeping with the usual femme fatale. She's forced to replay the titular song every night and undergoes repeated rape at the hands of the main antagonist. She's forced through repetitive trauma, much like Maria's repeated murders. Overall, I think you could take any of the characters in Silent Hill and put them directly into a David Lynch film and they wouldn't feel out of place, and vice versa. And that brings us to the last character, the town of Silent Hill itself. Sorry, I know that's a big cliche. I've got a good quote for this. Lynch's movies are not about monsters, but about hauntings, about evil as environment, possibility, force. This helps explain Lynch's constant deployment of noirish lighting and eerie sound carpets and grotesque figurines. The town of Silent Hill, which is heavily implied to be located in Maine in the northeast of the USA, is very reminiscent of Twin Peaks. Many of the similarities are very obvious. The towns are both surrounded by forests, they're both quite often steeped in fog, and they both appear like normal towns, but are hiding something darker lurking underneath. In the case of Twin Peaks, Laura Palmer's murder leads to investigations which uncover more and more depravity in the town. Whilst in the first Silent Hill there's the cult, and in Silent Hill generally there's the otherworld, the complete transformation of the town into a hellscape. This can be compared directly to the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks, which whilst not a hellscape, is a kind of extra-dimensional place where characters can still come to physical harm. Within the lore of Twin Peaks, the Black Lodge is known as a place of supreme evil, itself a counterpoint to an opposite construct of goodness known as the White Lodge. In Twin Peaks, the lodges are home to a few bizarre, backwards-speaking characters of various moral persuasions, including good ones like the Giant and evil ones like Bob. These realms are supposed to exist on a separate plane of existence to the town, and can only be reached under specific circumstances. When asked about the Black Lodge, the Native American deputy Hawk tells the story from the perspective of his people. The legend says that every spirit must pass through there on the way to perfection. There you will meet your own shadow self. My people call it the dweller on the threshold. But it is said if you confront the Black Lodge with imperfect courage, it will utterly annihilate your soul. This is very similar to the notion that James must go through the otherworld to come out the other side and be redeemed. As I previously mentioned, in Silent Hill, each character is experiencing their own version of the otherworld. Angela, for example, sees extremely phallic imagery imposed on the walls as a reference to her sexual abuse. Eddie sees reminders of the people that he's murdered. And then there are the specific references sprinkled throughout Silent Hill, such as there being a road called Lynch Street, and the fact that many of the buildings are directly comparable, for example, the diner and the bowling alley. So now we come to the art design and the audio, which are extremely important at setting the mood of both Silent Hill and the works of David Lynch. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the imagery in the game is directly related to James's guilt. The monsters are feminine, some of them are dressed as nurses, and there are strong allusions to the suffering of someone who's dying, with the creatures looking like they're suffering, and many of them contained in straitjackets. This kind of body horror has strong parallels in the works of other artists. So far, we've only been discussing David Lynch's influence on Silent Hill, but in this section I just wanted to bring in two other influences as I think they're very interesting, and very obvious once you see them. One I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Francis Bacon, who probably had the greatest influence on the visuals and art design of Silent Hill 2. Direct similarities include the use of body horror and the industrial elements reminiscent of abattoirs, with rust and blood-stained walls. Pyramid Head in particular would be at home in a Bacon painting, and feels like a direct inspiration from him. The other influence is Junjo Ito, a manga artist known for the likes of Uzumaki, which was written in the late 90s and was directly quoted in interviews with Team Silent as an inspiration. Uzumaki tells the story of the citizens of Kuruzocho, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, a fictional city which is plagued by a supernatural curse involving spirals, and its themes include a protagonist fighting against a supernatural force that is larger than him. A lot of similarities with Silent Hill 2. Moving on to talk about the audio, Team Silent were very clever with their audio implementation. It's used sparsely, which creates an unsettling effect. The radio static, which starts when an enemy is near, and crescendos, the closer they get, works particularly well at raising the tension. There are harsh industrial sounds which abruptly cut in and get louder. The soundtrack is brooding and eerie. David Lynch makes use of these effects a lot as well, jarring and out-of-place soundscapes which crescendo and get louder until they drown out all other sound. His use of industrial ambient noise is a Lynchian trademark. As much as Lynch is in control of the visuals of his films, he also likes to have a big say in the sound department. Trent Reznor, who worked on the soundtrack for Lost Highway, was quoted as saying that Lynch would scribble on a piece of paper and say, "This is what I want it to sound like." This combination of picture and sound fusing together allowed him to impact the mood of the audience to a greater extent. All of this combines to make a surreal and uncanny experience, which is a very effective form of psychological horror, both in Silent Hill and in Lynch's films. So to wrap this whole video up, it's clear to see that Team Silent took a lot of inspiration from the works of David Lynch when making Silent Hill. I haven't even been able to cover all of the references, similarities and influences in this video, as I had to stop somewhere. I've mentioned the things that came to mind for me, but maybe you've noticed other things that I haven't that stand out. If so, mention them in the comments. I'll be interested to read them. So if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and consider subscribing as I'll be making more long-form content like this in the near future.